Mr Chairman, I rise to speak because I know that the Minister there hasn't got a clue and won't get up and answer those queries. But nonetheless, I'll do my very best to offer an opinion. And Part 3 of the Act is really the political part of this legislation, because what happened in the late 90s when separation was forced upon the lines companies is that there were a whole lot of staunch National Party supporters who were deeply offended that these good people had worked for their communities, protected, built and nurtured these lines companies, and some of them taking on board generation when necessary. And Mad Max and his mates and the national government in the 90s came along and said, you've got to get out of that, you've got to separate, because the market's going to deliver to you and you're not allowed to be in both areas of the market. And it was a disaster, and those people were deeply offended, and some of them came and voted for us and put us into power in 1999. And I know they have been still deeply offended, and we moved in the direction to address some of their concerns, but I acknowledge that this bill does open up the opportunity for more of them to have more substantive generation and some vertical integration. I think the explanation in the bill says, not too much to allow monopolistic behaviour on the basis that, the market's still going to operate and deliver all these wonderful benefits to everyone. Anyway, that aside, what this does is allow sensible realignment in areas, particularly in some of the rural areas and out around. I know the West Coast in particular, West Power there, had a wonderful integrated company. They were forced to sell out. I think there was something like $40 million what was then realised by the community. The trust at the time said, well, what should we do with this? Should we keep it in? And it was a real dilemma for people who had built up these assets to provide secure electricity to the community, very good infrastructure, upgraded the line system. Any, as I say, surplus that they generated went back into the infrastructure. It was a very smart model. Nonetheless, Mad Max and the Honourable David Carter and his cronies forced separation. So they then had to divest their generation capacity. I know on the West Coast they got about $40 million. And then the trustees, and I say they were wrong, the trustees thought, we don't have a mandate to continue to manage this for the community. We're a lines company, so we must distribute this to each and every consumer. And they did. And there were some people, retailers, who did quite well out of it. Some people got $1,500, $2,000, a little bonus. The money went poof. It was just spent. And then, lo and behold, within a period of 2 years, when we were in government, I had that same company knocking on the door saying, we need some capital to upgrade the line into the West Coast because there's going to be growth in industry. And indeed there has been, and it's been an amazing success story. The point being that the stupid ideology that drove the national government in the 90s forced that trust to divest of the generation capacity, forced them, they thought, to divest of the money and the capital. And so that company is now building back up. Now, I know it will make use of this new provision because it already has some generation initiatives underway, and that's great. So they will be able to align the generation and the distribution network, and that's sensible. But it's taken the national government a while to learn. They are slow learners, but unfortunately other provisions in the Act that still rely on our market to deliver a great outcome will be flawed and will fail. But there will be some areas, and I'm sure that because those companies are still owned, the lines companies are still owned by the community, we know that for the most part they will manage that for the benefit of their community. And often in Wellington, I'm afraid to say, that officials in Treasury and National Party don't understand that actually there's a huge amount of goodwill in many rural parts. People don't just work for self-interest. They work, Mr. Chairman,
The Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. They work for the good of their community. And these people who had done this through the 70s and 80s and 90s to build up these strong and robust lines companies distributing secure supply were deeply offended when the nerds in Treasury and the nerds run by the National Party said, you've got to divest of this and throw yourselves out into the market. Well, I guess this is some token acknowledgement of the mistakes made then, because we are allowing, and indeed the Select Committee raised the threshold so that there can be some vertical integration occur, and that is a good thing. But, as I say, it's a sad state that it's taken too long. Mr Speaker, I read through Part 3 and I raised the issue in Part 2 about the bureaucracy we're setting up. This is the government that decries the previous administration and all the bureaucracy and the compliance costs and everything. So we now have, with Part 3, the High Court playing a part in the system. So we had the authority set up, then we've got the rulings panel to deal with disputes for those who may or may not be using the code, depending on whether they've been given an exemption or not. And now you've got in Clause 85, of course, if the High Court is satisfied on the application of the authority or any other person that the person has breached a provision of this Act, the Court may give directions ordering a person in breach to renegotiate any agreement. So now we've got the High Court playing in the arena. And then, of course, we go to Clause 87, and there's reference to the Commerce Act of 1986, which is kind of fair enough. That pervades most of our legislation. So we've got the Electricity Authority, we've got the Rulings Panel, we've got the High Court, and we've got the Commerce Commission. What a dog's breakfast from a government that says we're going to simplify everything, we're going to get rid of compliance. Well, who's going to pay for all this? Who? The consumer. Will it be the big companies? No, they'll always be able to negotiate a better deal. What about the small consumer? Who has been looking after their interests? Well, the national government never looks after the interests of the small people. Look at the tax cuts.
That's right.
Look at the tax cuts. $1,000 a week if you're on $1 million, isn't that right? And if you're on $30,000 a year, about $3. That's what the National Party calls fair. Well, unfortunately, that's the philosophy driving this legislation also. We don't trust the complexity of this legislation to deliver fair deals and fair electricity prices to New Zealanders, certainly not ones on low incomes. That's why we don't support it, and that's why we'll continue to point out, and I'm sure that it won't be too far down the track we'll be able to say, we told you so.
That's right.
Because the same idiots that said that deregulation and market forces would reduce the cost of electricity in the late 90s, well, those people have realised and come back to us saying, well, no, we didn't really mean that. Well, that was said at the time as justification. And what we're seeing here is Minister and National Party members saying this is going to improve the electricity structure, the industry, deliver better outcomes. I don't believe it for a moment. I do not believe it for a moment. I feel sorry for the officials. They are having to work within the constraints of flawed ideology run by the national government in all these areas. And so the one thing I point to, and I ask the question of the Minister, a slightly smarter minister, slightly higher profile minister in the chair now, can he explain how the Electricity Authority interfaces with the Rulings Panel, and then when the High Court, how they can intervene over the issues of separation and the thresholds around how much electricity is generated? Of course, that will change from year to year, I guess, and I'm not sure, I haven't been quite clear on whether that's maximum capacity, the 250 megawatts, or is that average capacity? Maybe that's one of the things the Minister can answer. And of course then there's the Commerce Act of 1986 overriding all of this, saying that, we have to make sure there's fair competition. Well, it hasn't ensured there's fair competition. We've had rorting, we've had price gouging, and it's